Hello, and welcome to an adventure like no other. Far more than what you have known, there is something far more to be known than you can ever know. And it is all about you, the real you, your real awareness with your intuitive senses. You were never taught that the real you, your real awareness, is operating 5 bodies in cause and effect, restricting creation. You have been taught to think that you are only a one-dimensional human person, with a mind and emotions, and with a very short lifespan on this planet Earth. More than what your mind can grasp is your intuitive senses that can be opened to see beyond all your restrictions. You have always had an opening to see beyond what you have known, and this has been purposely kept from you, and this is where you have heard rumors and stories about your nightly dreams. Your so-called dreams is your opening to your intuitive senses that will allow you, the personal you, to excel beyond what you have previously known. Everyone has intuitive senses, and very few people take advantage of what is possible by recognizing something more than their mind can understand. Creation has its place for all of us, and then there is all life, which is far more than anything than what can become with creation. Everything we experience is necessary for us to survive with whatever we choose and decide our life to be. New Kevin Smith is the great witness to something more than what can be taught and learned in any school. It can be so that when anyone first listens to Kevin's intuitive side experiences, also known as real side experiences, from what their personal mind has known, Kevin's manner of expression will at first be rather different to comprehend. This is where this introduction and reading the new books and Facebook groups will help. Have fun deciding. DUANE the Great Writer and Seer.
In this real side experience, I would be engaging with a particular expression of a body type, that which was more along the mechanical lines. As each real awareness operates a created form in the simulators, for this to be possible, so the simulator's overall multi-dimensional layout effected from ideas which manifest it will be taken on and uploaded in a sense to a consciousness, the consciousness as the engine room which effects body forms that can decode these ideas into the simulator overall arena that awareness operating through now can be afforded the view of. Each awareness then that operates with a specific simulator will each have as uploaded to their consciousness the same overall simulator template, that effectively all can experience the layout of its multi-dimensional nature, the equivalent of game players electing to indulge in the same game, and so must all have the game's base template uploaded to their computers, and thus share the same overall stadium or game arena experience. This then would formulate as a collective overall consciousness, the consciousness installed program that all simulator participants will share, an overall consciousness that is the simulator effected. Within this simulator shared arena, as the secondary personal selves become established, where the ability to utilize free will is made possible, so rather than the body forms being directly animated by real awareness, and be thus operating in ways that make sense according to natural environments, life or the isness that animates through all consciousness effected form, and so the is expresses through the body forms and the multi-dimensional environments that support them, with the disconnect from real awareness, which becomes so as the personal selves are established, and the true nature of the real awareness animating through the created body forms is forgotten, the personal self, as it free will generates ideas via the body vehicle mechanics, or agrees with ideas as created by others, These will generally be ideas that will not be supportive of life and the environments it animates through, a tendency more so to operate destructively and in awareness-suppressing ways. For the personal self has a perspective of segregation in relation to other forms, unable to recognize that all form is life as that which animates through it, for with such a realization and body forms would operate in awareness-bolstering ways. For to effectively suppress or restrict others is in reality limiting ourselves, as we all are and in the same life. We just each represent a different view according to our extent of recognition of the true reality and positioning in life accordingly. But absent of this recognition and the isolated personal self will tend to operate according to its own thrill-seeking interests, and more often as not at the expense of others, should the consideration be taken on that other forms are in some way hindering that which we desire, whereas in reality, in a simulator based on cause and effect principles, everyone can effect manifest whatever they choose, with no necessity then for competition or conflict. The consciousness of body forms, where the secondary personal self has been established and now fully embraced, will become then progressively distorted. For every idea we create or agree with that affects our corresponding simulated experience will be stored in the consciousness and continuously built upon like an ever-expanding database of files. Not only that, but as the secondary created self takes on a life of its own, so that which it is, its consciousness construct, will be fully embraced, as opposed to body forms directly animated by real awareness prior to the conception of the personal self, where the ideas that are the experiences, body forms and lifetimes effected are not held to and attached with, they are afforded objective indifference. And so, not only will the consciousness of the secondary personal self-immersed individual become more distorted as they overwhelmingly operate in awareness-suppressing, controlling, and destructive ways, but it will be a consciousness held to in its idea entirety, even as we assume new body forms each lifetime around, and all a previous idea affecting situation and circumstance is no longer available as reference in our current lifetime body conscious memory, the equivalent of every web page or site we ever have visited on the computers being opened and on the screen, as is rather apparent then, if the simulator is the overall consciousness affected, as every consciousness design is a part of this overall consciousness, as each consciousness contribution of each personal self-immersed individual is of distortion, increasing unconsciousness, and of every idea of the consciousness held to, which, as the analogy goes, of every website remaining open on the computer, so this burdens the computer's ability to operate at maximum efficiency, so the overall simulator, in reflected accordance, deteriorates, goes through its cycle, and just as when our computers may shut down under the sheer data stress it is burdened with, so the simulators ultimately implode. Our particular simulator has progressed to a point, in reflection to the distortion that the overall consciousness that affects it has become, that it is teetering on the verge of collapse and implosion, and a simulator sputtering towards its end will be an overall multi-dimensional arena that must reflect the level of distortion in regards to the nature of the dimensional positions it comprises of and the body forms residing within it. This simulator then becoming progressively shrouded in darkness throughout its various dimensions and levels, overwhelmingly an oppressive, forbidding realm, and a far greater manifestation of twisted and monstrous body types in operation. An expression of a body type will be that which is mechanical, as simply another vehicle for awareness to operate through, and although species may choose to go down the mechanical lines if it is an aid to survival, the robotic form more robust and resilient than that which is biological, generally such mechanical forms come into prevalence where a simulator is nearing its end, where the overall consciousness of idea restriction clung to effects as escalating expressions of restricting form in reflected accordance, the robotic forms become ever more widespread. As I said, mechanical forms in reflection of a consciousness very convoluted with restriction, but additionally, as the controller and slave dynamic is well established in creation, as agreements in consciousness allow the dark forces, in all their expressions, to exercise the power they have extended to them through their slave species, according to the agreement parameters, as everything an individual or species experiences, and in relation to others, is dependent on their decision and agreement, so the dark forces can, to various degrees and extents, robotize their slave species as an agreement afforded escalated mechanism of control. For although the slave species will have extended agreement that the foundation of their overall experience is domination and subjugation, they still have the capacity to free will generate their consciousness installed and experience affecting ideas, or generally agree with the ideas as created by the controllers, which perpetuates and advances the controlled situation they are in. The ultimate expression of control then is to usurp control of the slave species' ability to have a free will reign over their own idea installing mechanics, that through the assumed mechanization of the species, if such takes place, through a technology as connected to the robot forms, so the dark force controllers now can directly generate ideas through the robot slaves' body vehicle thought creating mechanics, akin to being locked out of our computers, and we sit back as another utilizes it for what purposes they do, and manifested will be the effects, what pops up on the screen according to the other individual's dictates. The controllers then wrest control of the free will of their robotized slave species to directly manifest through the species experience affecting mechanics an overall situation precisely as according to the controllers. For in this real side experience, another expression of this controller-slave dynamic would be playing out in whichever dimensional position it was taking place in. There would be a species that had been enslaved by the controllers through the agreements successfully secured that allowed such an experience as shared between species to be, and whatever had been the biological form of the slave species was no longer, as agreements had been progressively installed into their consciousness that had effected as the ability of their version of controllers to advance their agenda for enslavement to the extent that they had become robotized as a species. They had at this stage become completely mechanized in their body forms, though their idea-generating free will had not been wrested from them through a technology, as is the standard dark force methodology, at least not yet, but undoubtedly this would shortly be a situation that would befall them. Appearance-wise, they looked rather similar to the robot beings as portrayed in the sci-fi series Doctor Who called Cybermen, and interestingly, I have encountered this specific type of robot form before. For in a real side experience I shared months ago, as I and a group involved in an assignment where we were operating in a cave system, so these very robotic forms would lay siege to our position and attempt to destroy our operation and indeed eradicate all involved. They would, however, be unsuccessful, and they would be operating on the behalf of the Dark Force's interests. This suggested that what had been a biological expression of a form, a species, had been not only enslaved, but converted into this particular design of a robot, and now rather was driven to operate in nefarious and destructive capacities, as dictated by their version of Dark Force controllers. This would present as an opportunity, for although this robotic species were a military asset then of the Dark Forces, they had not always been so, their origins being that of a biological species that had been enslaved and somewhat forced to operate as the Dark Forces demanded. For as it transpired, their particular expression of mechanical form required a certain element to survive, something essential for the well-being of their robotic body forms that was available in the very atmosphere of the series of planets they were based upon. Additionally, although mechanical, they required a certain degree of the influx of organic matter that their forms were sustained, and this coupled with the element required from their atmospheres, and given that they were a completely controlled species, so the Dark Forces could manipulate them through the threat of withdrawing that which they required to survive. This would be achieved, if such were necessary, by sealing them in the structures they tended to operate within on their planets, and cutting off the air supply to them, the atmosphere which contained the vital element they required, and to no longer provide them with the organic material also essential to them. Completely dependent on the controllers were they for their perpetual survival, which expressed as a mechanism of control which equated to these robots as adhering to every dictate as decreed by the Dark Forces, including being deployed on missions of interference, disruption, and destruction where required. And so it was that I would find myself as one of these robot beings, part of their suppressed and controlled species, but of a position that was highly ranked among them, as they seemed to operate as a military outfit would, each individual assigned rank. The higher the rank, the greater their status, and the more influence they could wield among the robot species, though all would be under the direct control of the Dark Forces. I was seemingly then outwardly mimicking the form of one of their kind, with an associated rank of some standing, that my words and actions would carry more weight, as it was my intention of affording assistance to this enslaved robotic race. Realistically, as each individual and species determines their experience as the deciders, the impact others can have upon it is strictly dependent on what the species decides, the consciousness-installed agreements which affect the potential roles others can assume in relation to them. The dark forces only had been able to impact as they had to this point through agreements successfully placed in the robotic species consciousness that affected this as being so. For absent of the idea and no simulation can follow. The ideas present the roles others can assume in relation to the robotic species, and this would include the extent to which I could intervene in their enslaved affairs. As I couldn't directly alter their circumstances then, in accordance with the role I was able to play, as per their agreements, the best course of action seemed to be to engage with the robot species, operating across a number of planets, their home worlds, and in my highly ranked robot form, so I would share with them the idea references of the true reality, the nature of cause and effect creation, the foundation of all experience being agreement, and through becoming more aware, so can these agreements, which have us in restricting and limiting positions, be alleviated. The robotic species were at this point not only subconsciously locked into agreement with the controllers, lifetimes and generations of the species, extending agreement, which then presented as the effected foundation of their overall experience, that of control, and a subconscious then that can realistically only be faced and released of the ideas the species are unconscious of through the process of awareness and the new you song, but they had been overall consciously resigned and acquiescent to their plight also, through the ever-present threat of being denied the atmospheric element and the organic matter their mechanical body types required. In other words, the controllers had absolute acquiescence, subconsciously and consciously, which affected as absolutely a controlled situation. But that was about to change. I would begin to systematically pay a visit to each and every of their planets, and every structure they operated within, and my intention was to afford them the means, through awareness, that their situation could be improved. That realistically, it's not about fighting the controlling systems, of opposing them, for as we do, we are looking into the ideas that we are standing in opposition of, which is a tantamount to agreement with the controlling ideas we are seeking to oppose. For as we place a focus and attention on an idea, we are installing it into a consciousness where its nature will be affected as experience, that as we oppose the dark forces and their creations, we are agreeing in actuality to the consciousness that had created that which we are in defiance of, as the consciousness and that which creates it are indivisible. Agree with the idea, and you agree with the consciousness. And a dark force consciousness will be of a controlling, dominating design inclination, an intentionality we then upload to our consciousness through the attention and focus we place on their creations, including as we protest, buck and fight their systems, and we experience the nature of this intentionality in relation to them, that of a perpetual control. The protestations then allow the expression of this control to take the form of increased restriction in proportional response to the slave's revolt or uprising. Realistically, then, we position ourselves in the nowness of our real awareness, aside from all ideas of creation, aside from the ideas as generated by the dark forces. As such, we no longer are the effects as desired by the controllers. But regardless, it will take the moments it will to recognize this, and the first step is a conscious rebuttal and agreement with the drawing of the controlling systems in whatever form they take, and these robots were certainly prepared to do just this. But as I said, this still represented agreement extended to the controllers, and this would express effect-wise as the ability by which the controllers would begin to lock down one of the vast planet-covering structures and robot habitation areas I was stationed within on one of their planets, as the robots broke out into open rebellion. And necessary was it to attempt an exodus to the environment beyond before I and the robots I had engaged with were trapped inside. It hadn't been my intention that they openly revolt, but this had been the reaction in this particular planet habitation structure. My body form also seemed to be as structurally limited and dependent on the atmosphere as the robots I was attempting to assist, and so prudent was it for me to evacuate the structure with the robots also, that even though their species experience was that of control, there seemed no mechanism visually by how this was enforced. Impressions suggesting, however, everything was orchestrated through technology. The dark forces then operating beyond the robot planets through this technology that was incorporated with the species, and no seeming necessity was it then to have boots on the ground, so to speak, an absence of any form of dark force representing militia, etc. I would now be positioned on another of the robot's planets, and where the robot habitation areas comprised here of vast underground cave systems, as opposed to surface-based structures, as had been the case with the other planets. Still operating in my highly ranked robotic form, I would be engaging with another robot who also held significant rank among the robots of the particular planet I was on. The robot I was addressing would be exceptionally tall in relation to myself, what was an average in height robot form. The robot race were androgynous, they had no gender, all that separated them appearance-wise was height differential, assigned rank, and certain mechanical parts of their robotic heads would be at slight variance colour-wise. Very likely, as a formerly biological species, they possessed of a gender, but no longer. My other efforts had been met with varying success, in that I was attempting to have the robots help themselves through the awareness is recognizing a process. Practically all the robots of the species were interested in improving their circumstances. Some of the robots across the planets and structures had taken tentative steps at best. Some had broken into open rebellion and had suffered the consequences. And so here I would impress upon this tall robot the importance of, yes, taking the risk to step up, become more aware, but in such a way that isn't in open opposition to the control system they desire extrication from, to ideally establish a new position, the position of the nowness, of the real awareness isness, aside from any creational idea. He would consider my words, and seemed to grasp my meaning, I would suggest that he and all his robot kind begin to gather supplies of the organic material they required, should it be necessary to vacate the structures where they could potentially be locked in and deprived of the planet's atmosphere. For technology afforded what they required, but technology that could be shut off, and so prudent would it be to have the technology create a surplus of the organic matter, and for it to be surreptitiously removed from the structures, or in this case the underground cave systems, and secured in safe positions in the environments outside, should evacuation be required. He would heed my words and convey my advice to all the robots in the cave system, and transmit my recommendations throughout the robot species across the planets they operated on. Interestingly, as it transpired, the robotic forms of this species also had sensory receptors in their external mechanical outer layer, in that they could experience the sensation of the application of external pressure, that of touch, effectively. But according to the dictates of their controllers, any form of touch between the robots was prohibited. It was as though then, robotic they may be, but still were holding to vestiges of the biological forms they once were, that they had retained the ability to experience sensation in the form of touch, as I said. Very likely their forms would have become more mechanized as the species held to agreements extended to their controllers, which allowed the progression of their situation to become more restricting, that this sense of touch would have been removed at some point also. And perhaps the controllers would have exacted a means by which the idea-generating mechanics that each robot still maintained also would be usurped and dictated directly through the technology that would interface with them, as is generally the fate of most robotized slave species. But regardless, the experience would end there. I had taken the opportunity to engage with what has been revealed previously in prior real-side experiences as a robotic species that operates in dark force-orientated capacities, but as it transpired were so dependent upon their version of controllers, they were operating as such through the threat of being deprived of that which they required to sustain their mechanical forms, the organic material and the element they needed present in their atmospheres. And now I had afforded them the means of their extrication, an awareness process which involves a facing and releasing of all idea agreements of consciousness, which would include those extended to their version of dark force controllers. A process, if taken on, will afford them the means of their own salvation and liberation, a step at a time, my effort resulting in quite the array of a consequence, and it will be interesting to see what comes of this, and what further dealings I may have with this particular expression of robotic form and species.